All right, how many of you are not the same person as someone else? That's an odd question, Justin, but the answer is all of you, right? So we're going to talk about individual differences in perception. This is going to be kind of fun. There are some major sources of individual differences. We're going to talk about what those are. We're going to talk about age-related issues. We haven't really talked a lot about age in this class, but we'll talk about age. We'll also talk about sex differences. We haven't really talked a lot about sex differences in perception and perceptual performance either, so that's going to be fun. We'll even talk about some cross-cultural studies, right? And we'll talk about training and practice, and these are sort of the main sources of individual differences, right? So if you start to think about what makes you different than someone else, well, age, that's a major factor, sex, culture, and then expertise, okay? We are, for the most part here, going to ignore folks with sort of genetic abnormalities, right, Regan? That makes sense. We're going to ignore folks who've had brain injuries or injuries to their peripheral sensory apparatuses, right? Because these individuals are obviously going to have different perceptual capabilities than you, but that's not going to be related to one of these four kind of normal factors, right? So these are four things: age, sex, culture, and expertise. These are four things that everybody has is somewhere on the the continuum of those particular qualities, right? Does that make sense, Abby? Okay. And you are going to serve as a wonderful person for this class as an example. Yeah, because you have some expertise that the rest of us don't have, right? Being an art student, that's going to make it makes a real difference. We'll talk about that. And then I'm going to find whoever's the oldest in this class, and you'll have to serve as our example of age difference. I'm still looking, Regan. We'll find somebody. All right. What about vision? Let's just look at one particular sort of sensory modality there with age. This is going to be a very big surprise to you, Taylor. Older people don't see as well as young people. You weren't ready for that, were you? I mean, that's mind-boggling. You better write that down. It will be on the test, I promise you. But there's actually a little bit of a nuance to this, right? So it's not just like this sort of like, yeah, you get old, you can't see, okay? What's really interesting about this is this is sort of the standard, most folks are sort of in this range. Most of you are between 20 and 30, right? I think that's probably a fair estimate of where you fall on this. If you notice, you can kind of track these changes a little bit, and this is visual acuity in minutes, right? So it's not in degrees, it's even smaller than a degree, right? So this is measuring things, Daniela, even like taking a degree and chopping it into minutes, okay? What you see is about 45, you start to see a bit of a decline, and then at about 75, you start to see an even steeper decline. What's really interesting about this is if you kind of draw a line there, that's what, like 0.75 minutes or something, right? I mean, that math seems reasonable. And you go from like 0.75 to 2, right? That's the decline you're going to see in visual acuity as you get older. Now, there can be some other issues going on as you get older as well. I mean, they're like clouding of the lens. We'll talk about some of those things. But your visual acuity, Natalie, is going from slightly less than 1 minute of a degree to about 2 minutes, right? And so that is a change, right? Okay, you're gonna have to be closer to things. You're gonna have to perhaps have glasses, right? That's a thing that happens. So if you don't wear glasses now, you will at some point in your life, or get contacts. So that's kind of how this works. But that's a separate sort of accommodative issue. The change we don't typically think about is actually, Taylor, on the front end, right? How many of you were ever a baby? Yeah, that's happened to most of you. Some people not, Zoe. You meet those people and you're like, well, that guy was born as an 85-year-old crotchety irritation. And then somebody you know is like 27. You know anybody like that? You got somebody in mind in particular?
Oh.
Okay, well, you're lucky. I throw most people into that category, especially the people at Kroger. Most of them are in that category, though. So I'll tell you this. So working a job that's not like a standard 9 to 5 Monday through Friday job means you can, this is like the only great thing about being a professor, I can go to Kroger whenever I want. Like I can even go to Kroger in the middle of the day, right? And so the problem is when you do that, you get all of the other people who don't work regular jobs. And one subset of those people are the old retired people who take a really long time. And guess what they still do? I didn't realize people still did this. They write checks at the grocery store. It's like there are people who still do that out there. Oliver, do you know anybody who does that? Still writes a check at the grocery store?
I used to work at Kroger.
Oh, which one?
Alphabet.
Oh, so yeah, I've never been to that Kroger. I usually go to the one in Barbersville, closer to where I live. I've been to the one on Fifth Avenue occasionally, and then other Kroger in various other locations. None in the state of West Virginia, I don't believe. We didn't have those in North Carolina, no Kroger in North Carolina. Yeah, it was a little disappointing. It was confusing. They had a Lowe's grocery store. I know, right, Regan? That's what I said. I went down there and hey, can we go, because we were visiting to look for places to live, and we wanted to grab one of those like little apartment magazines, you know? And I said, hey, you know, where's the Kroger? We asked this person at the hotel, and they said, oh, you just have to go down to Lowe's and get those. And I was like, I've never known a Lowe's home improvement to like have an apartment guy like outside. They don't do that. And it was like a grocery store when we got there. So, and all the same. So for those of you that were babies, look at how bad your vision was. This is a logarithmic scale. I mean, that's like probably like 75. 70, right? I mean, that's like 10 times worse than your vision now, right? And look at how much better it gets rapidly. So by the time you're a year old, you're what, 8 minutes, and you really, by the time you get down to about 4 or 5, then you start to get sort of normal visual capabilities. This is one of many reasons little kids run into things. They don't see very well. I don't know if Imani, you ever see those little kids that run around, they don't know what they're doing, they run into stuff. Yeah, that's what happens. That's why it's really difficult to diagnose visual problems in kids before they get in kindergarten, right? So how often do you see like a 2-year-old wearing glasses? Not very often, right? Because it's not typically until you get a little older. I mean, one, everybody should wear glasses when they're a year old. I mean, look how poor their vision is, right? But then you're also not really, like trying to read or anything, right? So that's kind of like when you hit this age and you're starting to learn to read and do other things in school, then you can start to diagnose visual problems. So there you go. There's a steep increase in your visual capabilities early in life, and then sort of a gradual decline later in life. Okay? You're in the sweet spot right now. Look at as much stuff as you can. Because you never know, Zoe, right? Questions about that? You had something. So we should think about why, right? I mean, Abigail, we shouldn't just go, well, like that's what happened. So we should well, why does that happen? So there's some interesting reasons for those early improvements. Most of this is going to be due to the retina. You guys remember the retina? Right? It's that thing in the back of your eye with all those photoreceptors, kind of important for vision, okay? One of the things that's going to happen is you're going to increase the packing density of those foveal cones, right? And that's really, you remember the cones in the fovea, they're packed tightly. We've got the small receptive fields. Marissa, we're using that fovea for like looking at important things, right? That's where we're going to focus our vision, okay? So that is, as we're increasing that packing density, how many of you remember, and I'm going to be really impressed, so you should just raise your hand to impress me. I'm not going to ask you about it. How many of you remember interoceptor angle? None of you even bothered to lie to me. So, we briefly talked about this thing about having bigger eyes, and having bigger eyes is better, right? The bigger your eye, the better your visual acuity, because the amount of visual space devoted to each cone is less, right? Now the reason you don't have eyes the size of basketballs is, well, you can ask your mother why you don't have eyes that big, and she'll tell you. And if you can think about that, you can think about pushing 2 basketballs out of your exit ramp along with the rest of a baby, and you can imagine why eyes aren't bigger for humans than they already are, right? Okay. That sounds unpleasant, doesn't it? Yeah. Even if it's a deflated basketball, that still sounds unpleasant. So there you go. I always wonder, because, I mean, this happens occasionally, and please don't raise your hand because you don't need to share this, but I always wonder just if there's like somebody in class who's pregnant, and then like I'm telling them these like horror stories about like these giant clawing, screaming, gnashing balls of flesh coming out of their uterus, and they're like, I wish I had known that 4 months ago. And they're like really rethinking their lives. I don't know if that happens. If it does, and you have, you know, someone, I'd like to know. I don't really care who it is. I'd just like to know that that happened. The other thing that happens, again, this is going to be related to your cones, because most of the important vision that we're going to be doing as a human is going to be with our cones, right, Oliver? Because that's what we've got. Your cone outer segment's going to get longer, okay? Now, if you remember that outer segment, that's the guy catching photons, right? And if that thing gets bigger, guess what you can do? Catch more photons, right? And so because you can catch more photons, you can do a better job, right? Catching light. So we're in baseball season now. I don't know if any of you are baseball fans. So you've been following baseball. You kind of nodded on that.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah. Who's your favorite team?
Orioles.
Are you from Baltimore?
Maryland, yeah.
That's okay then. I mean, you don't have a lot of choice, right? I mean.
Yeah, I'm in the Nats, but.
Yeah, I mean, like if you just moved to the area, I would say that's where you'd have to go because it's National League, and they actually make the pitcher stand in the batter's box, and I think there's some poetic justice to that. I'm not a real fan of the DH, although there have been some great DHs out there I've enjoyed watching. But if you're from an area, you're perfectly allowed to be an Orioles. That's perfectly acceptable. We'll let you by. If you know anything about pitchers, right? So pitchers have these like super small gloves, right? You ever seen a pitcher's glove? They're like really little, right? And then you've got your center fielder that's got like this massive glove, right, Oliver? That's because he's just trying to catch more balls out there. You don't. Your pitcher, his job's not to catch the ball. His job's to throw the ball and then get out of the way, right? So throw it and lie down on the mound. That's the safe thing to do. Let somebody else catch it. We're not paying you to catch it. We're paying you to throw it. You just have to catch it when the catcher kind of like tosses it back. But they'll even walk it out to you. Like if you're that bad at catching the ball, they'll walk it out to you. I promise. So, bigger outer segment, you can catch more photons, your vision's going to improve. There's also, Justin, some increase in eye size. It's related to this concept called neotinning. This is actually kind of important. Neotinning is kind of cool, right? So this is how we have really big brains and not really angry mothers. Because we are born with sort of underdeveloped brains and they grow a lot. Right, Natalie, as we get older. So if you've ever seen a little kid and then their head, right? Because their brain grows a lot, and that's fine. And then their eyes are going to grow as well. Their eyes will get bigger, relative to the rest of their head as well, their body and whatever. So, eyes get bigger, cone outer segments get bigger, and we pack in more cones in the fovea. All 3 of those things are going to improve our vision very rapidly, very early on, okay? Now, for that sort of drop-off later in life, what are the things that happen? One is you have reduced pupil mobility. Here's something to watch out for, Abby. As you get older, you lose a lot of mobility in a lot of places, not just your pupils, right? So like your knees, your hips, elbows, wrists, those things, bowels, that happens as well. So you're going to lose some mobility there. So just, plan ahead for those things. Because you lose pupil mobility, you lose the ability to sort of adjust to changes in light. Okay? And you're going to lose the ability to, so your pupils may be open more or less when they shouldn't be. That's either going to create more of a we have that thing called the line spread function, right? And as your pupil gets bigger, things get fuzzier because there's more opportunity for those photons to be deflected. So if you're not closing properly, that happens. If you're too small, then you're not getting enough light, right? And so, Oliver, we go back to that idea we're not catching enough photons. We're not going to see as well. There's also stiffening and clouding of the lens, right? So that happens. So the lens becomes stiff, it gets clouded, you can't move it as much, right? This is why all folks will need glasses as they get older, because they, they lose that sort of accommodation ability, that ability to kind of shift, right, their vision, and that's why you will see your mothers, in particular your mothers, trying to stretch out their arms really far to read the menus when you're older, right? It happens. Invariably it happens. You can always step, right? And sort of the third thing that happens is just deterioration of the retina, right? How many of you have heard of like age-related macular degeneration, for example, right? So that's, you're losing those cones that you need for that important vision, okay? There are also some changes in brain function. This works on both sides, right? So that helps with that improvement early on, and it contributes to sort of that slow deficit as you get older as well. Okay? Anybody have questions about that? It's kind of cool, right? What about hearing? There's some age-related changes there. Again, it's a very similar story. There's an increase early in your life and then a decrease later in your life, right? The sort of an opposite story here. When we talked about vision, we said that was a really rapid increase and then sort of a gradual drop-off, right, Monica? In this case, it's sort of a gradual increase and a pretty rapid drop-off, okay? So early on, you might increase your sensitivity by about 10 decibels in your first year. So, there you go. That's not much. But later in life, you might lose as much as 60 decibels in your sensitivity. We also talked about losing particular hair cells, inner hair cells, right, Marissa? And we said that can cause some, certain frequencies. You lose certain frequencies as you get older as well. Okay. Why do we have these losses? A lot of this is related to decreased efficiency in conduction. So when the sound waves come in, they vibrate that tympanic membrane, and then they vibrate those auditory ossicles, and then they have to vibrate, and punch on the oval window there, and they have that cochlea business and all that fun stuff, right? Abby, remember that time I told you when you get older, you lose mobility? You lose mobility in a lot of places, including in your ear, right? So the same thing's going to happen there. And then again, we did talk about the loss of those cochlear hair cells. On top of that, Abigail, just to throw it in, there's some changes in the brain, right? Early on, that contribute to that increase, but also later in life, that contribute to that decrease. Questions about that? It's not so bad, right? Here you go. Here's kind of the graphs on hearing. Again, slight increase early, and then a pretty steep and steady decrease throughout your life. So this is probably the trajectory for me. This is the trajectory for you. Yeah, I warn you guys all the time about this. Stop using earbuds. Earbuds are going to kill your hearing. Okay? I cannot emphasize this enough. I really would like for you to be able to hear when you're 50, but you may not. So, watch out for that. There's actually an article a year or so ago, like in the New York Times about this maybe, or the New Yorker, about earbuds. You guys got to go over the ear. Or on the shoulder, right? That's the best way to do it. Get the old boom box, right? And just carry that thing around with the handle.
Over the ear sounds better anyway.
Over the ear, the sound quality is so much better. I was complaining the other day to a group of folks about how I thought iPods had killed sound quality. Because there's not, everything, so if you look at like a stack of things that you need to get good quality sound from a recorded audio file or a recorded audio format, whatever that is, whether that's vinyl, cassette, whatever you've got. You need a stack of things to make that sound good. And they've put all of that in the size of a quarter. You know what happens when you put things in the size of a quarter? You lose so much, right? You lose so much quality. It's just so disappointing. God. It is, Justin. But what are you going to do, right?
Start your own band.
Start your own band, yeah. It's really actually hard to and it's expensive to get sound equipment. Montana's little side note, there's this cool place, I don't know if you're familiar with Berea, Kentucky, which is like this like weird and odd place, like kind of in south central Kentucky, right? It's not too far, maybe it's like 2.5 hours from here. It's not like too far of a drive. But there's like a whole shop there and they like take old radios and refurbish them. Like even like stuff from the 50s and 40s, and you get these little like, it's like cool, like, you know, with the knobs and everything, you can buy like refurbished equipment, and they have stuff from like the 70s and 80s too, like actual nice, nice stuff. All right, Monica, you understand this? I think everybody else does. I mean, you can speak for the whole class. We're giving you that opportunity.
I think so.
You know that she's not that confident. She was very confident that she knew what was going on, but for some reason, Oliver, she was worried about you. All right. What about smell and touch? Nobody loves smelly old people that touch you. I don't know. I mean that's true. Not that all old people smell or are constantly trying to touch you. But they can't see you and they can't hear you. What are they going to do next? They're going to reach out and jab you in the face. There's actually, some evidence that shows there's a moderate sort of early improvement followed by some progressive decline later in life. Okay. The decline in olfaction is probably due because sort of the peripheral cells, we talked about those mitral cells and the glomeruli, those guys are dying off, okay? So you're losing some of those, not able to replenish that as well. So you're gonna lose some olfactory sensitivity. Your somatosensory, like the touch issues, are gonna be largely because you're gonna lose decreased skin elasticity, right? How many of you currently use one or more products to improve your skin elasticity? Yeah, Regan, raise your hand. I mean, there are a number of you. How many of you use a special face wash, lotions, creams? You've got ones for different parts of your face, like you put something under your eyes, you got something for your nose, something for your T-zone, right? See, I know these words. So I somehow have an array of bottles at home that I don't know where they came from, that I'm constantly being told, like, you're putting that on the wrong place. And I was like, well, it says face. So it's like the whole thing. You just stick it wherever you want. It's like, no, that's for like, this quarter-sized patch behind your ear or whatever. It's, I don't know. Also, you're supposed to like rub up. You guys know that, right? Instead of pull down. See, but Regan, I think like if I pull up, it just falls back down.
You're just not supposed to like pull at all. That gives you wrinkles.
Oh. Well. Should be a YouTube video on this.
There's plenty.
There's plenty, right? I need to spend some time. I'm just going to wear a mask. Or, I mean, by the time like I get wrinkly, like older in life, right, Justin? I'm going to be like using just a Snapchat avatar to deliver my lectures, and there's just going to be like some cartoon version of me up here. It's like, I'm ready for that. So I had a Nintendo Wii for a while, which is not surprising, right? Because I think how many of you have owned a Nintendo Wii? I mean, that's not out of the ordinary, right? So you go on there and you try to make your me, right? So I did that, and I was like, I got done, and it just looked like Robert De Niro. It's like, I don't know if that really looks like me or not. I was like, kept trying to like pick these different features, and that's what it ended up with. I was like, wow. There you go. Also, you're going to lose some touch receptors. That happens, right? things die when you get older. I know this is really like the really great uplifting lecture of the semester. Don't get old. You're not going to be able to see. You're not going to be able to hear. You're not going to be able to feel things. You're probably not going to be able to smell stuff. So there you go. And here's some graphs. Not a big deal. You get that little bit of sort of, what I think is interesting about this is you actually have, even up until you're 15, 25 even, you're seeing an increase in your olfactory sensitivity. That's pretty cool, right? Yeah. I think that's because you're like out there smelling things, right? So you're constantly like smelling something new and you're like, wow, what's that smell? And then you can kind of, identify that odor, and that's kind of fun. In general, what are some changes in your brain as you get older? Obviously, from birth, kind of in that early phase, you're going to have some massive and rapid increases in your brain weight, right? Your brain is going to be expanding and growing and developing. And that's normal, and that's awesome, and we should encourage that, right? That's the thing you should do. So when you're little, don't try to wear a hat that's too small all the time. It'll make your head too little. I do think that could, like if you were to wear a hat like all the time that was a size too small, I think you would have like a divot going around your head. Because little kids' heads, I don't know if you know this, they're soft, right, Macy? And so they tell you, this is like when you have a kid, they tell you this, like don't hit your kid on the top of the head at least until they're 2. Once they're 2, you can do that. Is that what they tell people in hospitals?
Well, no.
Not at all. But it does take a couple years for the soft spot to kind of become solid. So you have kind of a soft head there for a while, which is actually kind of helpful. Brain weight's going to decline gradually as you get older. You're not going to see massive decreases unless even if you're dealing with a degenerative disorder, you're not going to see a real massive decrease in brain weight, right? But you will see some loss there. Typically, now this is not dealing, again, Daniela, with like a degenerative disorder like Alzheimer's. That's going to be a separate issue, right? But in general, as you get older, you don't really lose the brain cells. Like you're not really, you're going to lose some, but the decrease is not because of the loss of brain cells. It's typically because you're losing myelin, right? And I know we didn't talk a whole lot about myelin, but myelin is it's kind of this fatty substance that wraps around axons. And it really works as like an insulation and a signal booster, so you can send signals faster, okay? And so when you lose that myelin, then it becomes a little more difficult for you to send those signals from one brain region to another quickly. It's not that you can't send them, right? It's just you have a little more difficulty doing that, okay? And that's one reason why you see older individuals, quite often they can tell you wonderful things. It's just going to take you 15 minutes longer to get it out of them, okay? So if you're going in and you're thinking you're getting a half-hour story from your grandpa about the time he, hijacked a ride on the back of a train to New Orleans for a jazz festival. I don't know. Maybe you guys had different grandparents than I did. Then instead of that being a very short story, it's going to take a little longer, right? It's going to take a little longer to get that story out. Lots of great stuff you can learn from old people. Because
I've always wondered, does increasing the fat of your diet, does that increase myelination in the brain?
I don't know. I've thought about that though. I've thought about trying to eat high-fat diets and then see if I could think faster. I do know if I ate a high-fat diet, I'd probably run slower. So there's like that trade-off, right, with the cardiovascular issues. And so I don't know if you had, you could do it in some range. That'd be interesting.
I'm trying it out right now. I'm on the 2nd month of the high-fat diet. I wanted to experiment with it.
Yeah, give it a try for a little while. Let us know.
It seems to be working, but I don't have any evidence.
You should do some cognitive tests. See if you could process things faster. Or you could just feed rats high-fat diets and then measure the myelin in their brains.
That could be done.
Yeah, we could do that. Pull out. You could do it with cranial nerves or something. Just measure the myelin because those would be easy to see. So there you go. It's another great study. Just throwing it out there for you. That's a good question, actually. I thought about that though, because myelin is mostly it's just lipids. It's just a fatty substance that wraps around your axons. So there you go. There are also all of these crazy like selective rearing studies that show changes in cell response properties. There are a number, like in vision, for example, they will do what they call red light rearing. And so they will have, rats, for example, that never get to see white light. They only get to see red light. And the red light, it doesn't activate their like visual pathways. And so their visual system doesn't develop at that normal sort of pace, because while you're going through the developmental stages after you've been born, you actually need exposure to each stimulus, right, to drive that sort of approach. So red light's a good one. Anybody lurk around at night and not want animals to see them? Anybody a night lurker? Nobody's into that. Anybody hunt or camp or track animals? Anybody ever been out at night in the woods? Okay. So quite often if you buy like I've got a headlamp, right? And it's got like 3 settings. It's got like a regular lamp, an LED, and then it's got a red LED, right? You can use that red LED to not kind of like startle animals and stuff. And also really freak people out, because when they like wake someone up, you're like shining a red light in their face. You can really have some fun with
You
that.
seem like you'd have a headlamp.
You never know when you need a headlamp. Yeah, I mean,
I got one.
yeah, I mean, you just need a headlamp,
Me
right?
too.
Yeah. We've got all kinds of things at home. But a headlamp's one of them. Well, so the rest of you should have headlamps too. Because I'll tell you, about every 2 months my power goes out. And I live in a new building. Like this building, like it's an apartment complex, it's 3 years old. It's in a, I would say Marissa, like a safe part of town. I don't want to say a good part of town, but it's like up the hill from Golden Corral, which I know in most places that doesn't sound like the good part of town, but here it is. Here, living up the hill from Golden Corral is not bad, right? So I live up the hill from Golden Corral, but my power goes out constantly. In the 3 years I've lived in that building, I think on the street we live on and like the street going down from us, they've probably replaced 10 to 12 electrical poles because people consistently run into them. Just run into the telephone pole and break it. Happens all the time. They did, when we first moved here, the February, like, so we moved here in December, in February, they replaced like 6. So our power was out for like a week. It was really disappointing. I had the headlamp before then, but it came in handy then, because you don't want to like walk around with a flashlight, right? Because then you can only like carry one other thing. And sometimes you want to carry
tire at night. Well,
change a tire at night. Yeah. I mean, all kinds of things. Tie your shoes. Tie your shoes if you have a headlamp, right? You can use both hands. So much freedom with a headlamp.
Can you not tie your shoes in the dark?
No. I'll have to try. I'm wearing slip-ons today. So there you go. Yeah. Actually, I used to never tie my shoes. And then I started buying my own shoes. And I realized that like tore them up faster. And then I started tying them and untying them. When my parents were paying for my shoes, they didn't really care. Is that same thing, right, Justin? Here's brain weight. So massive increase, right? So from like birth to, let's say, even up to 6 years or 7 years of age, that's a big increase, right? Because when you're born, it's like 4/10 of a kilogram, right? And it increases by an entire kilogram, right? I mean, you add like a whole kilogram to your brain in just a few years, right? That's a lot. I mean, it really is when you think about this, right? I mean, you're like tripling the size of your brain, right? Almost from birth to adulthood. And then you have a slight decrease as you get older. Not a big deal. All right. Who wants to talk about sex differences? Nobody wants to do that, right? That's like that's one of those things where it's like nobody wants to talk about this, but it's important and it's interesting and it's actually quite informative. So we should talk about sex differences between males and females. So this is looking at sort of 4 different modalities. One is going to be odor identification, touch, hearing, and then what we call mental rotation. kind of interesting. Now there's a very complicated story here we probably won't get into with the mental rotation bit, but we could do some other things. So, what do we see here? Males and females on hearing, we don't really see a huge difference, right? Slight difference in males and females when it comes to hearing capabilities. Touch, you know, there are some differences there. I think two of the interesting ones are odor identification and mental rotation. And females consistently perform better than males on odor identification tasks. Yeah, they're consistently better at identifying odors and identifying those, you know, with sort of a weaker stimulus as well. I think sort of my idea on this is that if you start to think about odor identification and you start to think about toxic chemicals and toxic substances, even in a non-industrialized society, right? There are still noxious and toxic odors, and I think my thinking on this is basically that's very important for the development of a child to not expose it to toxic chemicals. They do tell people that at the hospital, right? Like don't like ingest bad chemicals like alcohol, right? They tell you not to do that while you're pregnant. So I think if you were like someone who could potentially carry another person inside your body, then it might be more important for you to identify kind of like odors, right? That's important. On top of that, there's this other sort of hypothesis out there. I don't know, anybody ever smelled a dude? Like why did you sort of give me that face, Marissa?
What does that even mean? In what context?
Like in any context. Like have you ever smelled a man? Men tend to be more odorous than females, right? I think that's a fair assessment. When you watch all of anybody see the Febreze commercials? And they always are teenage guys, right? They never have a female like as the person who's creating the odor, right? They never have that. It's always like the guy's stinky socks, right? Okay. There's some idea too, if you think about like hunter-gatherer societies for a little bit, Oliver. You start to think about a bunch of guys together, like in one place. That's going to create some odor, right? And we still have those kinds of places. How many of you have ever been in a locker room? It's true. What was that, Ash? You've been in. I'm not going to ask why you were in a men's locker room.
Wasn't it men's?
Well,
Just locker rooms in general.
locker rooms in general, right? And so if you think about, like if you were on a hunting party with a bunch of other guys, you don't really want to be like, man, you really stink. I think I'm going to go home, right? So maybe being a little less sensitive to odors would be helpful so that you can kind of hang around each other for a while you're tracking down a woolly mammoth or something. That seems helpful, right? I don't know. Nobody thinks that's interesting?
I feel like men are almost more sensitive to smell.
Really?
Have you ever seen a guy trying to change a baby's diaper?
That's a different story. That's a body fluid related to some other person. That's a different kind of odor, right? It would make sense for a guy to like run away from that, but for a female not to. Evolutionarily speaking, right? Because for at least a brief period of time, the infant's kind of tethered to the mother, and so you're going to constantly be smelling those things. So there you go, right? But Band-Aids, you're really great at smelling Band-Aids. And cognac and oranges. They use Band-Aid. Like, how many of you know that Band-Aids have like if you smell a Band-Aid, you know what a Band-Aid smells like, right? You guys still use Band-Aids? You guys still cut yourselves randomly? They use that sometimes as an odor for. You're gonna go home and smell your Band-Aid box, right? I mean, it's like everybody has like a box of Band-Aids at home. And of course, now they make a lot of them out of the fabric, right, instead of kind of the latex rubber, right? So I don't know. There you go. So anyway, females are typically better, significantly better at odor identification. Males tend to be better at mental rotation tasks, right? Like related to some spatial tasks. Now, there's obviously some serious debate, right? When you start talking about what can a male do or a female do that's better, right? Ashton, that can really get some people kind of heated about stuff. I think what's important to keep in mind is a couple things. One, when you do these studies, you have to like design a fair and even study, right? That's not going to be skewed one way or the other. So that's great. But when you do that and you still get these results, then okay, so you let your data tell the story. The second thing you could always do is ask a rat, right? When all else fails, ask a rat. And what's really interesting about this is male rats are actually better at spatial tasks than female rats. And so that's gonna remove sort of one of the key sort of possibilities related to sex differences, and that's gonna be socialization, right? I think most of us who have spent the majority of our lives in the United States, and even other cultures, most cultures seem to be this way, that males and females have sort of different experiences as children, right? And they have different sort of experiences and different expectations, right? And gender roles are a very powerful component of our society, right? And so we're not near where we need to be on sort of flexibility on those, but we're making steps in the right direction. So socialization is definitely a concern, right? That's definitely something that could be there. Rats, on the other hand, don't really have socialization issues, right? And so if you ask a rat which is better at mazes, males or females, and if the males perform better, then that seems to be some sort of biological component there, right? So that's kind of interesting. I don't know if anybody thinks that's cool or not. I do. So when we think about these biological differences, again, this is controversial, but you can always go to other mammals. They've done this spatial task in rats, mice, voles, and monkeys, and then all of these species, males have performed slightly better at the spatial tasks. This probably makes a lot of sense, Ashton, because in most species of mammal, females provide sustenance for their offspring for a brief period of time, which limits their mobility, right? So if you can imagine like an opossum. Anybody ever seen an opossum? Yeah. And so you see them with like 6 baby opossums like hanging on to them while they try to like move, right? Okay. So that becomes a very sort of difficult task. So if you can imagine trying to walk while like 6 babies were hanging on to you, right? It becomes difficult. So you're going to try to not move as much as possible, right? You're going to kind of try to stay in one location. Now you're still going to need resources, you're still going to need food, so someone else needs to provide for that, right? And so because the male has no capability of producing food on his own for the offspring, he's the member of that family that could potentially go elsewhere and come back and bring those things. So they tend to be a more mobile species, and it would make sense, Oliver, right, to sort of have different brain structures for those tasks and develop them maybe more in one sex than the other in this particular case. I think where the controversy starts is when you start putting value judgments on things, right? And when you start using that data to make sort of stereotypical assessments, right? So when you say things like all women are bad drivers, I think you probably went a little far there, right? That's not cool. But when you say, like, according to the data, men are better at mental rotation tasks, well, that's the data, right, Zoe? So there's not really a lot you can say about that. You're not really saying that makes them better or makes them worse in any way. Females can go like, that's a Band-Aid, that's cool. And then males can go, I bet I can stack 15 of those in that box. And so if you work together, something happens. I don't know how many Band-Aids you can put in a box. I assume it's an almost infinite number because they're like so thin, right? That's my guess on that. Does that make sense? Any questions, Madison?
Almost infinite.
Almost infinite. Yeah, almost infinite. So there you go. I don't know, like if you think about what is almost infinite, right? I mean, that is infinite, right? I mean, like that's some like conceptual concept there, right? You say, I don't know, almost infinite. That's a puzzler for you. How much is almost infinite? All right. So, hey, while we're just talking about controversial things, why don't we start talking about people's cultures? That seems reasonable, right? I mean, we've already kind of laid it down with males and females. Now let's just talk about cultures. So one of the things that they do is a test called Pictorial competence, right? And so basically what they'll do is they'll give people these line drawings of outdoor scenes, and they'll kind of say like, hey, what do you see? And then people will have to go, like I see like two goats on a hill fighting each other, or that's like some trees and a river, I don't know, right? So it's whatever it is. Okay. Back in the 60s, I don't know if you guys, any of you remember the 60s? No, nobody remembers the 60s. How many of you remember the 1990s? Nobody remembers the 1990s. How many of you remember, like, as they called them in Britain, the noughts? Right? The before 2010s, right? The early 2000s, right? That's the noughts, because it's like 08, it's like naught 8, right? That's NAUGHT. Nobody's following this, right? Where are you? That's why, like, have you ever heard of like double knot spy? Like it's like 007, like 007. So like we would say like 0 or O, like someone not from the United States who's maybe from the United Kingdom would say not for 0. Nobody's. This is a great thing to talk about culture, I guess, right there. So, how many of you remember like 2000 to 2010? Okay. Yeah, those were some years, right, Madison?
Yeah, I loved them.
Yeah, I guess, right? Whatever. You probably loved them because you didn't have responsibility.
That's true.
That's my guess. You were like sitting at home, eating Fruit Loops, watching cartoons.
Absolutely.
I was also doing that from 2000 to 2010. I should have been doing other things, but that's what I was doing. We've sort of made a lot of progress just in 10 years, right? So if you compare like 2018 to 2008, and you start to think about our sort of ability to think about folks from other backgrounds and other cultures, we've made some progress. We've not necessarily made a whole lot of progress. If you dial that back another, 60 years or so, and you're like in 1960, then we're talking about an even bigger gap, right? And maybe even a much smaller appreciation for people from other cultures, right? And so we're dealing with some serious issues here. So this particular study in 1960, they took folks who were in urban or like schooled populations, folks who lived in an urban situation or going to school, and comparing that to folks in a rural situation who had not necessarily had been to school, like formal school. What they found was that the results showed that the folks from those urban settings performed better on the pictorial competence. Now, that result is not particularly helpful to us. Okay? What is helpful to us is to think about that study and the problems with that study. And a lot of the study issues were, experimental instructions could be different. Subject attitudes could be different, right? So if you think about someone who has never been in a classroom setting, okay, and then we bring them into a classroom setting to give them this test. Justin, how do you think that makes them feel? How do you, and you don't have to share this. We're gonna make you sort of the every student, right? How do you feel when it's exam day and you have to come in to class and you have to take an exam? You feel a little anxious, right? And how many times have you come into class and taken an exam? Hundreds, right? Over your academic career, hundreds of times you've come into class, not this class, other classes, whether that was, K through 12, whatever, and you've taken tests, right? We're all in that category, okay? We've all done that. Hundreds of times you've taken exams, and most folks still get a little bit anxious about that, right? Now imagine you've never done that before, right? Imagine you've never done that before, Taylor, and you're gonna go in and you're gonna take this test. That's gonna be kind of anxiety producing, right? More so than even now, what you might experience, which is normal. It's normal to experience that. So these folks from those rural areas, you know, they were already sort of at a disadvantage, right? And they're coming in and they've never been in this environment before. So their attitude's going to be different. Instructions may be different. Another issue with this is that, well, we'll talk about that in a moment. So these early studies don't take much from the results, right? Don't go out there and think people who are from urban environments are better at pictorial competence. Okay, Monica, don't think that. Take that study and pick apart the problems with it, right? Okay, and why this might be a poorly designed study, why you might want to do things differently if you were trying to actually figure out, is there a difference, right? There's also this idea called the carpentered world hypothesis. Have you guys ever heard of this? Yeah, it's kind of interesting, right? And so there's this idea that if you live in a highly industrialized culture, okay, which all of us are currently in a highly industrialized culture, right? Whether you have spent any time in another culture or not, right now you're in a highly industrialized culture, right? You live in a building that has square walls, okay? You have streets that, at least they intended them to be straight and squared off. And they have lanes, and it's a very structured, right? All of it's a very structured environment. Okay. So the idea is that, and a number of studies have looked at this, whether or not folks living in these industrialized cultures actually perceive angles and lines differently than folks who live in what they call predominantly natural environments. So if you think about, I think the term a lot of folks use now are traditional societies. So there are still some hunter-gatherer societies in the world, right, that haven't become industrialized. So if you think about individuals who live in that kind of environment versus folks who live in the environment you live in now, is there a different sort of perception? And what does that mean? So there have really been two sort of approaches to this. One of these is looking at geometric illusions, and the other is looking at something called the oblique effect. And the oblique effect is when you look at sort of angled lines and you try to judge lengths and so forth of angled lines, okay? So, here are some examples of illusions. Later today we're actually going to, this is called the Ames window. And later today, Montana, do you want to hold up the Ames window? Yeah, look at this. We have an Ames window for you, all right? So later today, we're going to take a look at that Ames window. It's going to be mind-blowing, okay? And it's going to be much better than what I've made people do in the past, which is watch like a half-an-hour video from 1940 produced by the U.S. Navy that shows you the Ames window. We actually have an Ames window. We found it just this past semester. So you're very lucky. You're going to be the first people to probably see this in this department in 25 years. I don't know how long it's been. It's been a while. So there's the Ames window. So if you look at this, what do most of you see here? I've already told you it's Ames window, so you're going to say it's a window, right? What they would see is that folks from what they would call a carpenter world, industrial society would say, yeah, that's a window. And they would say, hey, what shape is that? So what shape is a window? Yeah, rectangle, right? So you might say, well, that's a rectangle. In fact, it's not a rectangle, is it? It's a trapezoid, right? But because you know it's a window, what shape is a window? It's a rectangle. So you're going to say it's a rectangle, okay? So that's kind of interesting. But if you live somewhere that doesn't have windows, you're not used to seeing things like that, right? How many of you are familiar with the, this is kind of a good one, the Euler lines? Have you guys seen this illusion before? I always ask you, like, which one's longer, which line? Well, they're both the same. They're both the same, okay? Despite the fact that I know both of them are the same, and I always know both of them are the same, the bottom one still looks longer, doesn't it? I mean, I know it's the same length, Oliver. I know 100% same length. The bottom one still looks longer to me. Does it look longer to you? Yeah, it's not. I mean, we can draw the lines here if you want, but we're not going to do that. But it's the same length, right? It's a very powerful illusion. Okay? Individuals from non-industrial societies are more likely to indicate that they're both sort of the same length. And I think, to me, that's such a, I mean, this is sort of like beyond the scope of sensation and perception, right? So now we're just going to we're going to go up a level. We're just going to hang out here for just a minute. Okay? To me, this is such a powerful point. If your culture and your experience and the life that you've lived has created a situation where you look at these two lines and they look different to you than they do to me, something that's basic, right, Oliver? I mean, measuring two lines and telling me which one's longer, that's really nothing. That's not asking me, I'm not asking you, what do you think about controversial issue A or controversial issue B, or how should you treat people who are from this group, right? I'm not asking you very complicated things. I'm not saying if you should, support this or that. I mean, I'm not asking any of that. I'm simply asking you which line's longer. And if your cultural experiences can change the way that you look at the length of two lines, I don't know. I mean, that's pretty powerful, right? I mean, you start to think about how does that affect other sort of things beyond this course, right? Maybe you should take that cross-cultural course that we offer. Anybody ever taken that one? Yeah, with Dr. Mulder. Yeah, and then Dr. Hinton offers some good classes too, right? Have you guys ever taken his? He changes the title every time, so I'm not going to know what the title of it is. And there's a real reason he does that, but that's not important. It's like race and culture, right? And so he offers some great classes there as well. And so if you start to think about that, that's pretty powerful, right? I mean, so maybe you grew up in a traditional society that was a hunter-gatherer. Somebody else grew up in a society that was industrialized, and the two people come together, and they're like, oh man, those two lines. I mean, you could have a real argument about which line's longer, right? I can see this happening. And you never make it to the should we have social welfare programs or not, right? You don't even try that conversation. You can't figure out which line's longer. I don't know. You guys think about that stuff? Ever? You should, right? Because you're going to have these conversations with people at some point, right? You're going to get out there in the world and people are going to be from different places. And does that ever happen to you, Madison?
Yeah.
Thanks. Here's another one. This is kind of cool. Which line's longer? The vertical or the horizontal line? Nobody's going to answer, right? Nobody wants to go on the record saying which one it is. How many of you think the vertical line looks longer? Yeah, that's a fair assessment. It does look longer. It's not. It's the same length. Again, same issue here as what we were having there. And then E here is a similar issue. Which line looks longer? These two dashed lines. The line at the top looks a little longer, right? Again, same length. Okay? Folks from a carpenter's world are more likely to be tricked by this than folks who are not from a carpenter's world. Does that make sense? It's kind of cool, right? I think it's exciting. You guys may not. That's fine. You're going to have to write 12 pages of papers about it anyway. That's going to be the lab activity today, Monty. 12 pages. So, there are some criticisms, right? Most folks have claimed that these illusions are stronger in urban subjects than rural subjects. The criticisms are that could be instruction, subject attitudes. Again, we talked about this coming into this kind of testing situation, right? Also, uncorrected refractive errors. Okay? I'm looking out at a number of you, and I see that a number of you have corrected refractive errors. That means you wear glasses. Okay? If you are from a non-industrial society, what are the odds you're going to be wearing glasses if you need them? They're low, right? If you live here in the United States, the odds that you are going to wear glasses if you need them are much higher, right? Much higher. So those are all some, again, some criticisms, and I think that's important. How many of you are going to be psychologists? How many of you are just going to go out and like talk to people, like ever in your life? Nobody? It's always important to think about these things, right? Like how do you ask these questions? And this was a big problem with IQ tests. How many of you are familiar with IQ tests? Yeah. And so IQ tests, some of the early IQ tests were really, it really indicated that like Europeans were super smart people, right? And the reason for that is because it was Europeans who were making the test. And if I'm going to design a test that's going to determine how smart somebody is, you better believe I'm going to be good at it. Right? I'm going to look like the smartest guy in the world, and that's just a natural thing. The problem is when I give it to you, you're not going to look that smart, right? I'm going to look smarter because that's the way I designed the test, and that's a real problem. When you start asking people questions where it requires them to have some cultural knowledge that they're not going to have. It's not really an indicator of intelligence, right? It's just some shared cultural experience. And so that, when IQ tests, that's a real problem. This kind of stuff happens all the time, though. Anybody want a story about a moose? Yeah, so this was kind of an interesting story early on in the development of the United States. Obviously, people didn't take the United States very seriously, and why would you, right? It was like 13 colonies of a bunch of crazies who, for whatever reason, decided to leave wherever they were and do all kinds of things, right? And I'm not in any way saying what they did was right, because they did a whole lot of wrong things. But early on, Thomas Jefferson was one of the biggest proponents in trying to like establish the United States as an awesome place, right? And so he was constantly trying to prove to the people over in Europe, like, hey, we're a legitimate country, you guys shouldn't look down on us, right? There was this belief in Europe that anything that was in the United States, like anything that was in at that time was the United States, but anything that was in the New World, as they called it, was smaller, right, than anything in the Old World, right? So if something were to come to North America, then it would inherently shrink, right, over generations, and not just in like physical size, but also in like mental capacity, right? And so they tried to make this argument that, people who were in North America were less intelligent, and they were, cognitively deficient and physically deficient, and for whatever reason, Thomas Jefferson thought that was bad. I don't know that there was like he was as concerned about the racial argument there as much as he was concerned about the political argument. And he spent a good bit of his time while he was sort of ambassador to France, trying to prove this guy wrong, who was like a big French naturalist, constantly writing back to everyone he knew in North America saying, can you send me like the skeleton of a giant moose? I don't know if you guys have ever seen a moose. They're huge, right, AJ? I mean, like if you were to see a moose, you'd go like, man, that thing's massive, because they are. They're at least 400 feet tall. They weigh about 10,000 pounds. They're massive, right? I mean, a moose is very big, and so he spent his like entire, like he would write letters back like, yeah, we're having some tough negotiations with the French. We've got this like real problem about like real state issues, right? Like real international relations problems. You think you could send me a moose skull? And constantly he would write about this, and he wanted this moose. Finally, he got one. Unfortunately, Buffon, the French naturalist, died before he was able to show him this giant moose, which is kind of ironic and funny. But the whole point was he wanted to kind of prove that things didn't diminish when they came to the New World, right? And so things were still awesome. So I don't know. It's constantly, one culture's always looking down on another. You've got to be careful. Some of it's very overt, right, and intentional, and sometimes it's not, right? And you have to be aware of that as well. You have to constantly be looking out for what are the things I'm saying or doing that don't really jive with other folks, right? And I think that's a more complicated task. And if you ever want to like go back and like do a quick check, like, wait a minute, should this be, always go back to these two lines and go, which one's longer? And I always try to ask myself that. I know which one's longer. They're both the same. So there you go, right? That was like a side story about culture you didn't think you were going to get, and a giant moose. It's kind of a fun story. I don't know. I mean, how many of you know something about Thomas Jefferson, but it was not related to a moose? I'm assuming all of you did, right? Like, because he was like kind of like the third president, kind of like wrote that Declaration of Independence thing. You know, he was in on that bit. Lots of other stuff. Interesting guy. There you go. Oblique effect. This is kind of interesting. This is when you see reduced visual acuity for oblique lines compared to horizontal or vertical lines, right? Again, you know, back in the 70s, some folks found that it was stronger in urban subjects compared to rural subjects. Some folks continued this. They were trying to study the effect of environment and ethnic groups, and they actually seemed to think that it was related to genetic factors for this this oblique effect, that you would have a reduced. Some folks would have a reduced visual acuity for you know, vertical lines. So if you saw like a bunch of vertical lines together, or a bunch of horizontal, or I mean oblique lines, I'm sorry, or vertical or horizontal lines, you'd have reduced acuity for the slanted lines. It is quite possible, if you think about genetics a bit, it is quite possible, Daniela, that a particular, you know, sort of a group of individuals who are, you know, kind of closed off to breeding with, you know, folks from other places could perpetuate some sort of set of genetics that's different from other places, right? This happens all the time. This is why you have certain folks who are able to digest lactose as adults and some people aren't, right? This is why, yeah, this is why you have a lot of things. Like this is why you have particular diseases in certain groups, right? In particular, there's some diseases in Jewish populations and Amish populations, right, that don't seem to be out in the rest of the populations. That's largely because those are groups that intermarry, right? They don't marry. If you're Jewish, you don't typically marry someone who's not Jewish. So there's not like an influx of DNA from other groups. Same thing if you're Amish. It's pretty typical. So these things are possible. You know, there could be some genetic differences. So culture, you know, the end result is like, is there any effect? Well, maybe. Seems like culture might be kind of weak, especially if we're thinking here it's probably genetic factors instead. That's really kind of hard to pull apart, right? Is this because this group of folks, they all share some genetic signature, or is it because they share some cultural elements, right? Quite often that's very similar, right? I mean, if you were to kind of pick a particular group of folks, they're going to share genetics and culture, right? So it's kind of hard to separate the two. A lot of other explanations come out of this. What's really, one thing that's sort of interesting about this is like language and phoneme discrimination. This is actually kind of cool. So, and this was a much more recent study, 1995, right? Not that 1995, by then we had completely removed all sort of like problems like looking at other cultures, right? Because we, again, still haven't done that in 2018. But I would say 1995, we were a good bit better at it than in 1960, right? So we kind of progressed a little bit there. What was really interesting is they found that young infants can discriminate all phonemes. And what do we mean by phonemes? These are the short kind of components of speech, like ba, da, things like that, okay? By the time they were older infants or an adult, they could not discriminate some of the phonemes that weren't used in their own language. Now, there are particular phonemes that are used in different languages, right? And some phonemes are not used in some languages. Okay. Montana is a scholar of Japan. You might have some examples here of phonemes that are not used in the Japanese language that might be used in the English language.
R's and L's.
R's and L's are a great example. Those are very difficult for folks who are native Asian speakers, like so they speak a native Asian language, to then, especially if they didn't learn English until they were an adult, to then use those phonemes as an adult, right? Okay. As an infant, they could have discriminated those phonemes, no problem, right? Reminds me of this time I worked with a student from Japan, and we were in the lab together, and he kept telling me I needed to make a frog, which I Danielle, I'm very good, but I have yet to be able to make a frog from scratch. So what he was really trying to tell me to do was to make a flag, right? So there was that phoneme, he wasn't able to discriminate or produce those phonemes very well. It took us like 10 minutes, and finally he had to make one. It was like waving in the air, and he was like, Tagiro, and I'm sorry, I had no idea what you were talking about. So we had a good laugh about it. So it's,
My teacher actually got me off to the side one day and had a list of words and with R's and L's and had me recite them and record it, so that way he could study the difference.
Yeah, because it's not in their language, right? So it's really difficult as adults for them to reproduce that. Now, if they had grown up in a bilingual home that was English and Japanese or Chinese or whatever language, then that would be an easier task as an adult. So they would still be able to discriminate and produce those phonemes. So that's kind of interesting. Another kind of cool thing about Asian languages, in particular Southeast Asian languages, is they're like quite often tonal languages. So there's a difference, like Chinese is this way, where you will have one word, but you can sort of pronounce it, not really pronounce, but you can say it with 5 different pitches, and it will have 5 different, I know, right? Regan, isn't that so confusing? For you and I it is, because I'm gonna take a wild guess and assume that the sort of Asian ancestry in your DNA is 0 to none. Is that pretty accurate? And so that's what I'm taking a wild guess there. I'm going to assume most of your DNA more recently is from sort of European areas, right? So I don't know if any of you have ever been to Southeast Asia, but there's like something there that's different compared to Europe in terms of its climate. And the climate in Southeast Asia is very humid, right? Okay. And so because it's very humid, one of the things that you can do is you can have very elastic vocal cords. And elastic vocal cords, they're awesome, right? Because then you can kind of create these different tones and these different pitches. Now, if you were to move up to somewhere like Poland, not known as a humid place, and so if your language developed somewhere in that region, you're not going to have, your vocal cords are not going to be, because of the environment, they're not going to be as sort of elastic, and so creating a tonal language sort of in Europe would be very difficult to do, right? So European languages are not tonal, whereas Southeast Asian languages are. What's really interesting about this is not only is it like the language, but then if you start to look at the DNA that goes into making your vocal cords, right? So folks that have their DNA from Asia, for example, have more elastic vocal cords naturally wherever they grow up, because they had to, right, to communicate. So folks who didn't have elastic vocal cords weren't very good communicators and probably didn't reproduce as often. And someone from an area that's not as humid, less important, and so those kind of things can come and go, and it's not going to have an impact.
About like the desert cultures, like people who speak Hebrew or like Arabic that have like the kind of flimmy, flimmy words.
Yeah. It's the same idea, right? Because it's that environment, and you have to think about, I don't think folks realize like how much climate affects your language, right? I think that's like a cool intersection to think about. So there you go, right? Nobody's excited by that, but you should be, because it's really fascinating. Somebody should write a book on that.
You should.
Yeah, not me. I'll read it.
Yeah.
Hey, Abby, are you ready? Now it's your turn to be important in this lecture. Not that you haven't been important so far. I don't want you to feel bad about that. But now's the time where we're going to talk about formal training. And we'll even, how many of you are musicians? I know Montana, anybody else? Natalie, what's your instrument?
Piano.
Piano? And vocals? Well, that's interesting. And Marissa, you play the piccolo.
No, I played flute.
Well, the piccolo is just a sawed-off flute.
We've had this discussion.
I know we have, but I thought you played the piccolo and not the flute.
I also played piano, guitar, and drums.
Oh.
So there's all that too.
There you go. So the flute. That's just like 2 piccolos together. My sister played the flute for a while. my parents bought this extremely expensive flute. You know, like flutes can be pricey. She bought, they bought her the flute that has the holes in the keys,
Okay.
right? So that means something, right?
Yeah.
That's more expensive than just like one without the holes, for the most part, right? Because she was good. Like in like the 6th grade, it was like, all right, so she's going to be like this phenomenal flautist. Is that how you pronounce that? So she was going to be a great flautist. And then you know what she did? She floundered and she quit. She played like 1 year. My parents invested, I don't know, like 2 kidneys and an arm into this flute, and then she quit. They should not have been surprised, Imani, because my sister also played basketball for a year. She was on the volleyball team for a year. She did ballet for a year. She did baton twirling for a year. She was in the, what do they call it before you're a Girl Scout?
Brownies.
She was in the Brownies for a year. She was a cheerleader for a year. She did tumbling for a year. And this was like all before she was 7. So there's like 12 years of things she did. And it was just like, why did you buy this flute? That was, I don't know how much it was. And then I was over there playing the drums on this like $25 practice pad, right, with some sticks I like borrowed from my band leader. Finally, I got like a $300 drum set, which was now like a $1,500 drum set, but it's a separate story.
You should like sell it to your friend.
Huh?
Yeah,
You should
then
sell
you
it to
sell
your
it to
friend.
your
I did. I'd like to buy it back from him, but he's sold. Expertise, formal training. Some people have that, right? Musicians, for example, are better at timbre discrimination and auditory streaming than non-musicians. Okay? So for those of you that were musicians, if you were to listen to, I'm going to pick 2 instruments that I think might sound similar, but I'm going to certainly say that you guys are going to laugh at me. What about like an alto and a baritone sax, right? Like your average person might go, that was a saxophone, right? And that might be what I do. But you might be able to go, I think that was a baritone sax. Or you might be able to tell the difference between a tuba and a sousaphone. I just know that they are different. I don't know that they sound different. You don't know that tuba is the thing you hold in your lap. And the sousaphone is the big white snake you wear around that you have in the marching band. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I'm impressed that you do that because
Yeah.
a lot of people are like, oh, tuba. And I'm like, no.
No, the sousaphone is for the marching. The tuba you got to sit down and hold. And then there's the baritone that's slightly smaller than the tuba. There was this guy who was sort of my friend in college who was first tuba in our band. So, and we went to Oktoberfest, which was, and so they would all dress up as like people from Halloween movies, like horror movies, and then they would like play the tuba and then run out into the crowd and like fake stab people. And then there was a guy, the band director would be up there acting like he was Rod Serling, like doing like, Welcome to the Twilight Zone or whatever. Tonight's episode we have for your viewing pleasure. Telly Savalas. I don't know if you guys watch the Twilight Zone, you should. So there you go. And better at auditory streaming than non-musicians. How many of you have ever tried to listen to classical music? Yeah. And how many of you have gone, wow, that just sounds like music. But you have someone else there and you're like, wow, can you hear that first violin? They're really like hitting these notes perfectly. And you're like, I don't even know what a first violin is. I thought it was just music. Like there's just like one instrument that makes this kind of noise. But other folks can kind of pull out, parts of the song, right? They can kind of listen and do better at that auditory stream. So that's cool, right? I don't know, anybody excited by that? Artists, on the other hand, Abby, are better at what we call size and shape constancy than non-artists, right? So that's kind of a cool thing too. So, what do we mean by shape constancy? Okay. Which one of these ellipses most closely matches the shape of the mug top in the picture? For those of you who are not trained artists, you're probably going to choose something down in this category, right? What is the shape of a coffee mug? It's a circle, right? Now, Abby, if you're going to draw a coffee mug, Do you draw it as a circle?
No.
No. You draw it as an ellipse, right? And in fact, if I were to ask you, you would probably pick something in this category, right? On that end, because that much more closely actually matches. And if you were to kind of draw this, you can see that it's very elliptical, right? Probably somewhere there. Whereas most of us would have picked probably one of those two, right? Nobody would probably go all the way to full circle, but a lot of folks would pick something that was much more circular, okay? So that's kind of cool. And it's called shape constancy, right? You know that a mug is a circle, so it's got to be circular. And that's why those of us who are not very, like, let's say trained at, like if I ask you to draw a coffee mug, right? How many of you would draw it like this? Big old circle, and then a handle. There you go, there's a coffee mug. Look at that brilliant coffee mug. Now, if Abby were to draw this, and Abby, I'm gonna, please forgive me. If you were to draw this though, you would probably draw this. See how much better that coffee mug looks, right? I mean, I know, Imani, don't laugh too much. Final grades aren't in. But you can see this looks much better than this guy over here, right? And again, that's because it doesn't really look 3D. It's got like this weird extra, like if I were to cut it off like there, that would look better, right? Okay, so it's called shape constancy. So we have some training in shape and drawing. You know that when you're drawing that three-dimensional world on a two-dimensional platform, you've got to do some changing, right? How many of you read comic books? How many of you have ever read a comic book? Yeah, Ashton, which one was it?
I've read a few. I'm in a comic book class here.
Really? What do they let you guys read?
Batman Year One,
Okay.
Blankets, and I can't think. Wait, I suppose
What?
The Watchmen.
Oh,
The
okay.
Watchmen.
The Watchmen was great.
I didn't like it.
V for Vendetta is so much better. And you should read V for Vendetta instead. And tell your professor I said that. And that's an acceptable substitute. That's a much more brilliant book. But Alan Moore in general is top quality. And Batman Year One, that's not so bad either. I wish they would have you read some other like independent stuff. I was sort of more than that. But.
Well, we get to read one at the end of our choice. I'm doing The Walking Dead, because that's what I'm into.
Okay, that's fair, I guess. All right. So, they do a thing called foreshortening sometimes, right? Where they'll like in an action scene, they'll have like a big fist in the front and then like the body kind of smaller so it looks like they're jumping out of the page, right? So, I don't know, anybody ever thought about being a comic book illustrator, Oliver? No, I've never thought about that either. Because I draw coffee mugs like this. I don't think anybody's going to hire me. Abby, what grade would you get to the, I mean...
I don't like to judge art.
You don't like to judge art. I'm going to put that in the folk art category. That would do better in the folk art category, right? Because that's like, there's no formal training there. So there you go. Although I took this drawing class once I was a real nerd when I was younger, and I loved school so much I took summer school classes for like fun. And so my local community college offered like summer classes you could take, and I always begged my parents to sign me up for these. So one year I took a drawing class, and I'd like draw pictures. And one thing we drew was an upside down Rita Repulsa from the Power Rangers, which I was like not even into Power Rangers then, and we had to draw her upside down for some reason. I don't know why. I didn't get much out of that particular class. Abby, I apologize. What about practice? How many of you ever practiced something? Yeah. So if we do have you practice, for example, like a contaminant in an odor, right? So if we give you like a familiar odor, what's something that you guys all smell? Steel mill. That's a familiar odor, right? You guys have been outside here. And then we were to put something in there that was a contaminant, like fresh air. You would. Taylor thought that was really funny. And I'm glad you did. I feel better about you than I did 10 minutes ago. So you would be able to notice that there's a contaminant in there, right? How many of you are familiar with like strawberry? That's a pretty standard smell, right? But if we were to slip in a little bit of like toad, I don't know, right? Whatever odor a toad has, you're going, I smell something funny in there. But if I give you like an odor that you're not familiar with, like how many of you are familiar with, trying to think of like an odd odor that most of you wouldn't be familiar with. Like, you know, if it was an unfamiliar odor and then we slipped in something, you wouldn't be able to recognize it as well. You can actually improve your visual discrimination as well, right? Sometimes we have to 15% if you do some practice on that as well. So practice makes a difference. Practice makes perfect. Or perfect practice makes perfect, actually. Because you can practice bad things and not get any better. This is a heads up there. All right, what about brains? So that's kind of cool. So like if you're an expert, you actually have a slightly different brain than non-experts, right? So we already asked some of you who are musicians. I know some of you are string musicians, right? Montana's in that group. Marissa's in that group. Natalie, are you in that group? The cello?
No, piano's a string instrument.
It is. It is.
Probably not.
Although I think it still might actually work. But string musicians actually have a greater representation of the fingers and somatosensory cortex than non-string musicians. So there you go, right? So that's kind of cool. How many of you love taxi drivers? Nobody raised their hand on that. Daniela almost did. She was like, I don't know. I've had some fun ones and some not so fun ones. So taxi drivers actually have a larger hippocampus. Now, this was in 2000 when they did this study. So I don't think taxi drivers today have a bigger hippocampus than the average person. And the reason for that is it's just 3 letters that make the difference here. And that's GPS, right? So before GPS, guess what a taxi driver had to know? How to get places, right? They had to know how to get places. And so your hippocampus is actually a location in your brain where you do a lot of spatial mapping, okay? And because of that, if you were constantly trying to use that map, Monica, you would have a bigger hippocampus, right? But I think now, especially now with these like semi-professional taxi drivers, that's what I call folks from Uber. They're semi-professional taxi drivers. I don't think they have any idea where anything is. They just go, what's that address again? And they put it in their GPS, and then you're flying, right? You guys ever use Uber or Lyft? I see them all the time here in town. I mean, do they make a good business doing that?
Yeah, there's like the party Ubers. It's like flashing lights and stuff inside.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
I had a terrible experience with an Uber.
Yeah, I've heard some bad things about
Well,
them.
like, we were at, my friends and I were at a rock festival, and we didn't drive, we just Ubered there because there's a lot of traffic. And so we're waiting, like, we had to walk like 5 miles to get away from where everybody else was so we could actually get one. And the guy, like, he's like, yeah, I'm an Uber, like, I'll take you wherever. He's like driving, he had already started driving. He's like on his phone trying to type in the GPS. He curved and almost hit somebody, and then his doors wouldn't unlock when we got to our hotel.
Wow.
We almost died.
Or when you get in and you tell them where you want to go or something, or like, or you get in, they're just like, nah, I don't really feel like going there. You get kicked out.
Really?
I don't know they.
See, if I was at a rock festival,
I mean, they do. They came in like.
I would have come home with a pocket of rocks and just thrown them at the guy. Because it was definitely a bunch of geologists, right? Wasn't that kind of rock festival? I don't think people are walking 5 miles to get to a geology festival. Although sometimes you have to get that, you have to walk that far to get to like a dig site though, right? So maybe. All right, so there you go, taxi drivers. I don't think Uber or Lyft drivers have like a bigger hippocampus than you do. So there you go. What about idiosyncratic differences? What in the world is an idiosyncratic difference? Well, these are things that aren't attributable to those other, like, you know, sort of major sources right now. So it's not age-related, it's not sex-related, it's not related to your, you know, culture or expertise or anything like that. It's just individual differences amongst people, right? What's really interesting on this is, so, you know, there are individual variations in the size of your visual system, for example. Sometimes cortex is bigger, visual cortex is bigger in some individuals, sometimes it's not. Not really clear that this actually makes a difference in your visual capabilities, right? Your brain, your visual cortex can be massive, your retina may still be the same size, right, Taylor? So, I don't know, right? So there are all kinds of limiting factors and potential bottlenecks, right? So that's important to keep in mind. All right, any questions about that? All right, so what should we do?